Hi everyone, my name is Nick, and today we're going to go over what I would consider to be 6 essential plants for achieving a tropical themed indoor jungle. So we recently discussed 6 plants for a boho style jungle, so this is sort of carrying on with that kind of series. But if boho more fits your aesthetic, perhaps you should go check out that video as soon as you finish watching this one. So I think a great starting place for sorting out your tropical themed indoor jungle is to begin with the plants that I think we would all agree are most often connotated with tropical vibes, and those are palms. So this one right here is a Rhapis EXCELSA. This is actually the only palm that I grow in my home at the moment, and that's because this is a very hardy indoor palm. I'm sure when I say palm, the first thing that's coming to your mind are those frilly, frondy palms that are just blowing in the wind. One that's really going to fit that criteria is the Majesty Palm, and I will put a photo on screen for you to see right now so you can know what I'm referring to, but you're going to see these practically every time you walk into a big box store or nursery. They're probably going to be as tall as me and only cost you a measly $20, and that's because these plants aren't grown for you to grow in your home. They're for like restaurants to put out on their patios in the summertime, or for you to put out on your patio or balcony in the summertime, or to purchase for a photo shoot or a wedding or something like that. Like, they are very throwaway plants. I hate to say it, but that's just why they are so cheap. And I feel like people often see them and think, oh my gosh, this giant plant's only $20. And then you kind of find out why it's only $20. So by all means, it's worth trying for the minimal price that it costs, but it's also worth skipping and just using that $20 to invest in a better palm, which unfortunately the palms that are better suited for your homes are going to cost a little bit more money, not on par of these like crazy philodendrons that are just like multiple $100s, but a sizable palm will cost you probably at least $100 at most nurseries. So a couple of the varieties that I'm referring to are, as I mentioned, the lady palm right here. Also the Kentia Palm is probably the palm that's most going to give you that frilly, frondy vibe that is rather expensive though, and you probably are going to have to ask your nursery to order that in for you, because most often, because they are a little bit more pricey, they're not going to bring them in when people are just going to want to buy a Majesty Palm for a quarter of the price. Also, the Fishtail Palm is fantastic. It has such a vibe. It's a very hardy palm. It was one of the few palms that I was willing to sell back when I worked in the industry. So there are palms out there that are suitable for the home. They are just kind of few and far between. Parlor palms and areca palms are much more common palms that are on the market, and they will perform better than a Majesty Palm. I just don't think they're going to perform as well as the ones that I'm mentioning, but you can get whatever you would like, spend whatever amount you're willing to spend, but a nice sizable palm is really going to set the scene for your tropical themed jungle. It's going to be the first thing that everyone sees, the first thing that everyone notices, and it's really going to be the star of the show. When it comes to caring for your palms, I think the most important thing to remember is that they really do require a little bit more light than many of the other plants that we grow in our home. And they also do require watering a little bit more often, which, you know, with that added sunlight, they're going to be drying out a little bit more quick. So just something to keep in mind there. But, you know, this lady palm right here is one with thicker, darker green leaves that can handle the interior of spaces a little bit better. In fact, this is probably a plant that you're going to most often see growing in like lobbies of hotels and spaces that are receiving very dappled light. Still some sunlight by all means, but not nearly as much as the ones with the more frilly fronds are going to require. So an excellent starting place is palms. I think that is going to be really the plant that's going to really set the mood for your tropical jungle. And moving on from that, I really think that an excellent addition to that, a complementary plant to your palms, is going to be the ever so common golden pothos. And really you can use any pothos in this situation. I will go over one more example after I talk about this one for a little bit, but I think this is going to be the one that you're most often going to see growing in tropical areas. In fact, this is one that you're probably going to often see growing up trees, perhaps larger palm trees in the tropics. That's just growing up, vine climbing, and as this grows higher up the tree, the leaves begin to mature a little bit more, and they will grow a little bit larger and form some splits in the leaves, really get that tropical aesthetic to them, but also just that splash of yellow variegation to them really stands out and really just makes this look like such a houseplant that you would see growing just like in the forest in Hawaii or in Brazil or something like that, which I'm sure it is. This is one that I passed over for quite a few years when I first got into indoor gardening, and that is something I really regret because it is such an amazing houseplant. In fact, I even pass them over still to this day because I noticed when I was sitting down to film this video that this is the only pothos, golden pothos particularly, that I have in my home, because I gave all mine away when I moved because I just assumed I had so many of them, but then I got rid of all of them. So now I just have this little one right here that's left over from a project I did recently, but in no time this will start to just vine for days. This is one of the fastest growing houseplants. Once this one starts to work its way out of the planter and its vines get longer, it can grow practically a foot a month in the growing season. So you'll get a lot of growth out of these throughout the year. Whether you have them trail or climb up, they are really going to give you such a vibe. And also there are just so many varieties of pothos. There's the plain green, which I absolutely love. There's the neon, there's the marble queen, which sports more white variegation in comparison to this yellow. And one of the more popular varieties on the market as of late is the Cebu Blue pothos. So this is Epipremnum pinnatum Cebu Blue. So this is a different species in comparison to the other one I just shared with you guys, which was Epipremnum aureum. But this one also will give you very tropical vibes in the sense that as this climbs up, it will also get larger leaves and form splits in the leaves, probably a little bit more pronounced splits in the leaves than the golden pothos that I have right here. I will put a picture on screen as long as I can find one to show you what I am talking about. But even though varieties like this have been gaining popularity over the last couple years, I do still think that the standard golden pothos is just the most quintessential pothos. It is one that everyone should have in your home. And if you are like me and skipping over it because you are just deeming it too common, don't continue to feel that way. Bring one in your home and you will see why you are missing out. But especially if you are trying to achieve tropical vibes, once those start to vine and trail for just forever, they get some real long legs on them, you're really going to understand why it's so important that you have one in your home. So very similar or closely related to the pothos, speaking of the splits in the leaves that they get, I really would like to touch on Monsteras. So this one right here is a Monstera adansonii, and I feel like these split leaves are just something that we really often connotate with tropical vibes. And of course I would say that the most iconic Monstera is Monstera deliciosa, which is often referred to by many common names like the breadfruit plant or the split leaf philodendron, even though it's not a philodendron, it's just what they call it. The Swiss cheese plant, this was a houseplant that just really skyrocketed in popularity over the last couple years, and it makes a lot of sense. Those leaves are pretty killer. Unfortunately, mine's a little bit too large to hold on camera today. I will share with you some footage, but instead we're going to be talking about this Monstera adansonii today, which also will get some really large leaves, particularly as you let it climb up a surface like a moss pole or in the wild if it would be growing up a tree. Very similar to the golden pothos or the Cebu Blue pothos. But this does also perform very well as just a trailing houseplant. I have mine just kind of jumbled up in a mess here. I have a little stake in the center of the planter where I'm just kind of wrapping some of these vines around to really give it the effect that it's just a super, super full planter. And I think it works. It really does look fantastic, but this is another one that is truly a quintessential houseplant for achieving those tropical vibes. And fortunately, it's not very expensive at all. You can, these days, find a nice, small, full planter of Monstera adansonii for probably less than $15, and you can also purchase a very large established Monstera deliciosa for no more than $50, and that's like really pushing it. Like if you're at a boutique houseplant store, it will probably cost $50, but if you're at like a grocery store, it's going to cost you like $15. So however much you're willing to spend, keeping in mind that the specimens that you're going to find at the houseplant stores that cost a little bit more money are probably going to be a little bit more well taken care of and look a little bit better. But a Monstera deliciosa is a houseplant that you can start off with just a small tiny plant, and in a few years you're going to have a really large sizable specimen. And I also do want to touch on another Monstera that's been gaining a little bit of popularity in the last couple years, and that is the Monstera Peru right here. And this really does give you those tropical rainforest vibes. In fact, I would say this is almost pushing more on those like prehistoric jungle vibes, which is giving me the idea that maybe that's another type of video for this series that I could carry on to talk about. But I really do appreciate how this really just looks like it was just torn out of prehistoric times, really does give you that tropical jungle feeling. The leaves might just be plain green, but that corrugation that they get is just killer, and absolutely the reason why this houseplant has been so sought after, and it's pretty amazing. This is a houseplant that I was a sucker for too a couple years ago when it first hit the market, so I totally understand and absolutely have to talk about it today. But Monsteras across the board are just very, very easy to care for, whether you're having them grow as a climbing houseplant or kind of like just letting them do their own thing. They're very reliable plants to grow in the home, and that's probably because most of the varieties, their leaves are quite thick, so they just really handle our home settings very well, whether our humidity is high or low. Of course, if they grow in the rainforest in their natural habitat, they would appreciate a little bit more humidity. But Monsteras have become very prevalent houseplants on the market for good reason, and that's because they're just very easy to grow. Next up, I believe this is number 4, we're going to discuss a group of houseplants that deserves way more attention for houseplant enthusiasts, and that is orchids. So this one right here is a coconut orchid, or a Maxillaria tenuifolia, but all orchids are lumped in this category. I feel like as houseplant enthusiasts, we often don't go for orchids because we're more into the foliage of our houseplants. But if you've never grown an orchid before, you don't understand the effect that those flowers have in your home when they are in bloom. It is just completely, it changes the aesthetic, whether it has a fragrance or not. Just the appearance of the flowers amongst all of the foliage that we grow in our home is killer and really makes you feel like you're sitting in a tropical rainforest. So this coconut orchid I think is really interesting because it's just got this nice grassy foliage, which, you know, like I don't think a lot of houseplant enthusiasts would really care about this, but when it flowers, it smells like coconuts. And maybe it's because I have a soft spot from my late teens for Malibu rum. Still to this day, I'm bold enough to admit it, that this is just such an incredible houseplant. I really love the look of it, and it's very easy to care for. That's the most important thing with orchids. I personally am very hands-off when it comes to my houseplants, and orchids are very, very drought-tolerant houseplants. They're not like many of the other plants that I'm talking about today, where if you let them go for too long, they are crisped up and dead. Most often with orchids, you're just going to find that like their pseudobulbs, for example, on this type of orchid will just get really shriveled up, and upon a few waterings, nice saturations after that, they will perk back up. In fact, this is one that I have left for too long. I had it in a back corner of one of my windows. I was not paying attention to it, and I think it's really come a long way. And even right now, this sphagnum moss that I have it sitting inside this planter is bone dry. I have been watering it more often than I have been in the past, don't you worry, but it still looks perfectly fine. I will go ahead and water after this video. In fact, I see that there's a bunch of new growth coming in, which I'm very excited about. So hopefully this upcoming growing season, I will get a nice amount of blooms on this orchid, but I'm still new to this one. I've just smelled it at like botanical gardens and where I purchased this orchid, which is Waldor Orchids, if you are curious at all, which is a very renowned orchid purveyor in the greater Philadelphia area. It's by Atlantic City, so it's still like an hour and a half outside of the city. But if you do live in this area, highly recommend it, especially if you have not dipped your toes into orchids or you've only tried like the ones that you find at like your local Trader Joe's. There are so many incredible orchids, and be careful because you're going to understand why people get so addicted to them. I am being very careful. But even though orchids are most often grown for their blooms, there are plenty of varieties out there that are also grown for their foliage. I think a great example of that would be this ever so lovely Ludisia DISCOLOR. This is commonly referred to as a jewel orchid, one of the many varieties of jewel orchids. I'd say this is probably the most common one that you're going to find on the market. And the foliage is just freaking gorgeous in comparison to many of the other orchids that we're used to seeing. This has that dark green foliage that's nearly black, the pink streaks, the kind of bit of purple that's hiding on the back side of the leaves. And while I was growing the coconut orchid in sphagnum moss, because that's more of a epiphytic orchid, this is more of a terrestrial orchid, so I do have this one growing inside a more soil-based mixture. But even though this is grown for its foliage, you can see that it is also in bloom. So here's an example of some orchid flowers. Obviously, the foliage is the star of the show, it goes without saying, but I still really appreciate the flowers. They still do have an effect on my home. And I really do love how many flowers are appearing on this flower spike. You can see there's already roughly 8 to 10 that are opened. And in this cluster of flowers up here that still has yet to open up, there is still probably another 8 to 10. So really a large amount of flowers on this spike. I am a little bit surprised. This one is rather new to me. I've probably only had this one since the summertime of 2021, and I did get this one from Steve's Leaves, which is a great time to remind you guys that from now until the end of March 2022, you can use code NICK15 to save 15% on any purchase that you make on stevesleaves.com, excluding any of the auction plants, which they have many of the houseplants that I'm talking about in today's video available. And of course, I'll be sure to leave a link in the description. But orchids are just such underrated houseplants. I think they deserve so much more attention, especially from houseplant enthusiasts. But at the same time, they need to beware because once they get their toes wet, they might find themselves neck deep in orchids. I understand completely why orchid enthusiasts get so head over heels for these plants, especially because the more orchids you have, the more likely it is that you're going to have one in bloom at all times. And they're just so incredible, like so incredible. I need to get a couple more orchids myself, especially because you can grow them in such obscure places because you can like mount them to pieces of wood, or you can grow them in banda baskets, which are just light as a feather. You can hang them practically anywhere. So there's so much to do. Perhaps we'll have to talk about it in another video someday. Next up, we're going to discuss this one again. I feel like I've been talking about this so much, and I apologize because I'm also pretty sure I'm talking about this in my installment of Plant of the Week on Monday. Then I'll be done for a while, I promise. This is my Stromanthe sanguinea Triostar, and this falls into a group of plants called prayer plants. And these, if you're in like a tropical climate, somewhere that's going to be professionally landscaped, you're going to see these everywhere in shaded areas. And that's because they are just such beautiful houseplants. Now, these are, I think I called them in my last video, like the catfish of the houseplant world, because you see it and it's just so gorgeous. And then you bring them home and then suddenly they just kind of brown up and crisp up and look terrible. So, you know, you gotta do a little bit of research and kind of learn how to take care of your prayer plants. But this is just like the epitome of a tropical houseplant to me. Like, look at this, look at the color it's got, just the overall vibe that it has. Like, this screams like Hawaii to me, it screams Florida to me, it screams Brazil to me, just everywhere tropical and lush and gorgeous. This is what I feel when I look at this plant. There are plenty of other varieties of prayer plants out there though. This is just the one I talk about all the time because it's one of the only few that I have in my home, and it's the only one I think I have in my home that really just shows off all the colors that prayer plants are known to have. I grow a couple other varieties of prayer plants in my home that have more green foliage, which I absolutely love. The Calathea orbifolia is like one of my favorite plants that I have in my home. Such a vibe, just not as much as that tropical vibe. Still has a tropical vibe by all means, but just not as much as this. But I do have another example of prayer plant just to give a little bit more variety since I just talk about that Stromanthe so damn much. In my most recent video that we did the other day, we planted up this low light houseplant arrangement in my houseplant tips and tricks series that I do with repotme.com, which be sure to check out. I'll also leave a link in the description below where you can click on repotme.com, and if you shop through that link and buy anything on their website, I get a little kickback. So thank you so much if you do that. But in this houseplant arrangement, we included this Maranta, LEUCONEURA, Erythroneura, which is just the classic red-veined prayer plant. This is probably the most well-known, most common prayer plant that's out there. In fact, I feel like this is the prayer plant that is known as a prayer plant. Like, I feel like everything else is not known commonly as a prayer plant. I guess they are, but this is the one that if you go into a houseplant store and you say, I'm looking for a prayer plant, this is what you're gonna get. And this is just the red vein variety. There are plenty of other colors out there that you're going to see, just like with Calatheas and Stromanthes and Tenanthes. There's just a lot of variety. There's practically every color under the sun that you're going to find. I'm going to put this one down because it's getting a little heavy, but do be sure to check out my low light houseplant arrangement video that I did recently because it was a lot of fun. But as I was saying, these are just finicky houseplants. They do like lower light scenarios, which I think is the only thing that this houseplant has going for it, because practically every other thing about this houseplant is a headache. They're a little bit pickier when it comes to the water that they receive. They like distilled water. I use tap water in my houseplants. I don't really care. If you want to go the extra mile, you can use distilled water, or filtered water is even better. The issue that you're going to come across with your prayer plants is that they can't transpire out some of the things that are in the water, like bromine and chlorine and fluoride and stuff. They can't transpire it out of the tips of their leaves, so they're going to get a little bit brown, as you can see right here. And if you're not receiving enough humidity with your prayer plants, they're going to get some brown edges. Now this one right here is one that I've had in my home for not terribly long. I've probably had it for about a year and a half. But when I received this from a friend, it over time just browned, crisped up, died back. But the other good thing, I'd say the only other thing besides the fact that they're low light that these plants have for them is that they are very tuberous. So they have these like rhizomes that they'll grow at their roots that store a lot of energy. And so if you bring one home, suddenly it looks like crap like instantly, even though you think you're caring for it correctly, it's probably just acclimating to your home. And by acclimating to your home, it's losing all of that foliage that it grew that looked so damn perfect in the greenhouse, because that's just not how it's gonna look in your home. But once they acclimate, they grow back. So none of this foliage was on my plant when I was gifted this plant from my friend. But these 3 plants all grew in from the tubers that this plant had formed in its root system. And because these have grown their whole entire life in my home in the conditions that I have, they've been holding up with the humidity that I have in my home, which is not as ideal as the greenhouse, but that is why I'm able to have my leaves looking so perfect. So if you're not giving your prayer plants enough humidity, particularly when you're just bringing them home, they're typically going to get brown edges to the leaves. So you can kind of troubleshoot what's going on with your prayer plant, where it's browning or yellowing. So if you're getting brown tips, it's probably an issue of the water that you're giving it. If it's edges, you're probably having an issue of the humidity. So at least they tell you what's wrong with them. I will give it that. These are also a magnet for spider mites. I feel like this is one of the first type of houseplants that I had to deal with plant pests on, because they can be quite the magnet. But now that I have fewer prayer plants in my home, at one point I had like 25 different varieties. Now I have like 4 if we're including that Maranta that's going to be in my home for probably the next week until I gift that arrangement away. I have much less of an issue with my plants having spider mites and spider mites in general. Be wary with your prayer plants. They're freaking gorgeous. I understand you want to bring them home. Just maybe be picky and choosy with the ones that you bring home, because you might not keep all of them in the end. I also equate these to the bouquet of flowers of the houseplant world, where you might find yourself replacing them every now and again, just like you do with a bouquet of flowers. But as this one's proving to me, if I do just hold on to them a little bit longer than I like to, perhaps I'm going to get some really nice foliage out of it. So this one really is inspiring me to try out a couple more prayer plants in my home once I have a little bit more room, let's put it that way. And last but not least, we're going to be talking about another very colorful houseplant. So this is one that I think really is going to also set the mood in your home. It can also be one of those more showy, larger pieces. So this is my Ficus elastica Tineke. I would also lump the Ficus elastica ruby into this category. And I would say that I personally feel like most Ficus give me more of that boho vibe. However, Ficus, Tineke, or Ruby gives me the exact opposite of that. Even all the other different variegated Ficus out there just don't necessarily give me a tropical vibe. But this one just screams it to me. Like, I've never been to Hawaii before, but this is like what I imagine all of the plants look like in terms of that vibe of just lots of shades of green and variegation and reds and pinks and all of those lovely colors that you see that just kind of make you want to sit on the beach and have a pina colada. So this one is just a real outlier in terms of Ficus for me. And this is also a very common houseplant. I feel like this has been not elusive in terms of like some of the plants on the market, but this is just kind of one that like would hit the market, then disappear for a little while, then hit the market, then disappear for a while. So if you can't find it right now, rest assured that in a couple months it's probably going to appear out of nowhere for next to nothing, but they're very, very inexpensive. The only thing is though that these variegated varieties in comparison to the plain green variety or the burgundy variety grows a little bit slower. I've had this one for, honestly, probably about 4 years at this point. And it's like, what, 2 feet tall, maximum? It's not very tall. I do imagine this is a plant that, now that it's really acclimated to my home, could grow up to my ceiling in like 10 years. I'm not expecting that anytime soon. Also, I should mention that this desperately needs a repotting. It's been in the same planter for the past 4 years. I'm sure it's completely depleted of nutrients. This soil, I can tell, is not the most moisture retentive, which, speaking of which, I should talk about the care for Ficus. So they are not the easiest houseplants on planet Earth. I think people most often refer to these as creatures of habit. You gotta get your Ficus settled into your space. You wanna leave it in the same spot. You don't really wanna move it around. You don't wanna shake the tree. I've seen on like TikTok the whole Ficus tree shaking. Just blow a fan on it. Don't shake it. You don't want to mess with the roots, but it's just trying to simulate the air movement that plants receive outside, and they sway a little bit in the wind. But I mean, wind's not grabbing your plant and shaking it. I'm sorry, I could go on about that for a long time, but don't shake your ficus. So water them not too much. I feel like one of the biggest issues with ficus is going to be the watering. I feel like many people, maybe for their first house plant, just bought like a fiddle leaf fig, for example, which was a horrible decision. Sorry, but you bring them home, maybe you think that you water your plant once a day. Maybe you think you water your plant once every 3 days. I don't know what you think, but that's too much. That's a little bit too much for a ficus. Most often you're going to find that your leaves from the bottom of the plant typically are going to start turning yellow and falling off. If you're crazy overwatering your houseplant, you might find that your newer leaves start to turn black and rot away before they even start growing, or just as they're beginning to grow when you think that you're getting some new growth. So there are a couple different things to look out for. But I say I'm probably watering my ficus in that magic spot that's like, I'd say like every 7 to 10 days. Of course, it depends on what size planter you have. If you have it in a small, like a very small baby ficus and like a tiny, tiny 4-inch terracotta planter, you're gonna need to water that thing a little bit more often. But if you just bought your ficus, maybe you bought like a 10-inch plastic planter of ficus that's got a couple of plants in it, you're probably gonna be watering that, I'd say like roughly every 8 to 10 days, I think is that spot you're gonna find. But once you get in a routine with your ficus, you're gonna kind of wanna follow it. You don't need to follow it to a T, but if you start to go a little too long not watering it, you're gonna get some wilting. And the one thing that kind of sucks about ficus is that they take a little bit of time to recover from watering, or they just don't recover well at all. However, Ficus elastica is one of those easier ones, I will say. These leaves are a little bit thicker. I'm more thinking like a Ficus benjamina, which is just that like classic, I forget what they call it. It's the fig. If anyone's growing a fig tree inside their home, it's gonna be a Ficus benjamina. And it will lose leaves from practically just looking at it. This is not that type of ficus. This is going to be much more reliable. So if you have failed with ficus in the past, but you want to kind of give them another go, I would say that a Ficus elastica is a great bet. Just in terms of the lighting, you're going to need to remember that these ones that have the white variegation in the leaves are going to require a little bit more light. So I've always grown my Ficus elastica, the variegated varieties, inside the windowsills, versus the non-variegated varieties. I've been able to pull back a little bit more into the interior of my space. Just be sure not to let your ficus sit too wet for too long. That is when you're going to find most of the issue. But find the Goldilocks zone with watering your ficus, and you're going to have a really beautiful tree for years to come. In fact, speaking of ficus, I'm like, I really want to make a space in my house. I really want to try growing a fiddle leaf fig. I've never done one before. I had a little tiny one for like a couple years, but I want to give it a go. I feel like it's really got that boho aesthetic that I like, which, like I said, if you prefer boho aesthetic, be sure to check out my 6 essential plants for growing a boho jungle. Thank you again for joining me. If you don't already, follow me on Instagram at Philly Foliage, subscribe to my channel, and I will see you guys in my next video. Have a great day.